demand for change is sweeping through the health sector. At the ongoing World Health Assembly, the People's Health Movement, the Third World Network, and Public Services International are among the organizations calling for a revamp. Where does this revamp start? According to these organizations, it should begin with how the World Health Organization is funded and how its activities are decided. Countries spend so little as a proportion on the world's healthcare needs that it has hurt the WHO's independence. It is no longer as free to decide what to do even during a crisis. It was once famously said that money doesn't score goals. So what does it do? We look at two developments in the sporting or football field, which are a kind of study in contrasts. Man City's recent big successes and Borussia Dortmund's gains in Germany as it prepares for a big clash with Bayern Munich for the Bundesliga title. We'll be looking at all this in today's Daily Debrief. A press conference should be regular fare at the World Health Assembly, but a host of key NGOs working in the field of health and associated rights have said they want drastic changes in the World Health Organization's funding pattern. They got together at the Assembly very recently and pointed out that the biggest funder, the United States, and its biggest companies or non-government organizations cannot dictate what healthcare strategies, research, medications, and devices the poorest in the world get to access. We'll go over to People Health Movement's Jyotsna Singh, who's in Geneva attending these sessions. She will also explain why the Médecins Sans Frontières report on Ebola vaccine access has parallels with everything that went wrong during the COVID-19 pandemic. Jyotsna, good to have you here and good to have you able to join us in the midst of this very hectic meetings that you're in and out of in Geneva. So before we take off, the PHM had some submissions today. You joined hands with two other organizations. What was this about?
Yes. So the day before yesterday, four organizations, PHM, then Third World Network, Society for International Development, and Public Services International, four NGOs came together to actually address a press conference. And basically the topic was sustainable financing of WHO. So just to give you the context, over the past many decades, WHO's financing has become really problematic in the sense, initially WHO was run primarily by the money that the governments would put in, which is called assessed contributions. But slowly, then donors started to put the money in because in the 80s, there was a freeze on how much the governments were paying. And WHO actually consists of governments. It is a multilateral agency, right? And then donors have started to put in the money. Today, the situation is that 83% of WHO's funding comes from donors, such as, and these are primarily philanthro-capitalist foundations, such as Bill and Melinda Gates, Rockefeller, etc. So they then, because they are paying so much of money, they start to guide the agenda on which WHO would work, because only governments are paying only 14%, and WHO does not have money to set its own priorities because government funding. So there are some governments who would say they want to put money only for certain projects, but the assessed contribution, that pool that I talked about, that is then for WHO to decide. It is not a tight funding at all. So the tight funding has increased, which has meant that WHO is losing its independence. It is not able to decide priorities on its own because then it is works only if the tight funding is more, then they decide how WHO works. So that has become an issue. And we are seeing...
Just to interrupt you for a quick second, if it's 83% of the funding, then this has happened over some time. Were there warnings along the way?
Absolutely, yes. So that has happened. So looking at all these things, it was 2 years ago that WHO, a particular committee of WHO, PBAC, Programmatic Management Committee of Executive Board, it has started to look into this matter, and that's why it is called sustainable financing, because when donors are paying you, you do not even know how long will the payment keep coming, right? So it's project-based. So how to ensure WHOs, and it very correctly analyzed that tight funding is the problem. earmarked funding is the problem, and which we learned last year. It was the committee had to work over 2 years. This year, when the final recommendations from the committee had to come, which came, and it said WHO needs to have more flexible funding. And the next paragraph says WHO should continue to take the earmarked funding. It is institutionalizing the problem that exists. You are saying that the problem is tight funding, and you are saying that we continue with that. And there was a huge expose by Geneva Health Files, which is run by this journalist Preeti Patnaik. She exposed that the US, actually the government had pressurized the WHO to include this. The US said it will not let this resolution be adopted unless earmarked funding is allowed. So US wants to basically run it because Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the biggest donor, which is close to the US government. US government itself is one of the biggest donors. Some of their money actually is earmarked. So it's a huge push. The WHO has been basically forced into becoming dependent on not independent, not autonomous.
So, Jyotsna, that's what I think the press conference is trying to warn people about.
Yes, warn that, and so say, and to take a clear-cut position that we do not accept earmarked funding. It cannot happen. Earmarked funding cannot be the destiny of WHO. It has to come up with another solution, and which is assessed funding and mobilize money from the governments. I think just briefly, it is also important, I think, WHO, the countries would pay more to WHO if they start to feel that their problems are being solved. So it becomes, so it's a chicken and egg situation also happening, but that has to be solved ASAP. And so, I mean, earmark funding cannot be the destiny of WHO. It will just make it lose its autonomy completely.
Jyotsna, you also told me briefly about this other meeting where the aim eventually is to talk about the pandemic treaty. What was that particular meeting about?
So there was in other event, MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, they actually released a report which is on new Ebola treatments. Very interesting, because through that experience, they are trying to say what should go into the pandemic treaty, which is also being discussed at the WHO. And there will be meetings in June, very important ones. So basically what it's, it is just terrible to hear what is happening. Ebola, as we know, is one of the most devastating infections. Most of the people end up losing their lives. Up to 90% people lose lives if they get this disease. It is heavily infectious. It spreads fast. But there was no medicine for it for the longest of period. First time it was found in the 70s, and there was no treatment. In 2020, 2 treatments were approved by the US FDA. Very effective treatments. People can be saved. People are being saved using, can be saved using them. But the interesting part is that people in Africa who actually get this disease have no access to these medicines. And that's what the MSF report showed, because the treatments, actually, these 2 medicines were the research happened by a lot of public funding, governments, but they are not. Its funding is not the only part. There are patients involved who go through clinical trials, who give their samples to let these treatments work. There are doctors involved who actually treat these patients during the clinical trials and other research and development. They work with it. So there are NGOs, there are these countries' governments, their health ministries involved, the survivors, the patients themselves. But when it comes to deciding who will get these treatments, it is only the pharmaceutical corporation which decides. But in this case, it is actually the US government also. So US government was among the biggest funders for this research. But as soon as the treatments came out and they approved it, they stockpiled all the treatments available. US government has it is hoarding the treatment when people are actually dying of this disease.
Right, Jyotsna, I completely understand why you're saying Médecins Sans Frontières is talking about the pandemic and this Ebola treatment in the same breath. That's 2 parallels which nobody will forget.
Exactly. And Ebola actually, while the discussions are happening, it is being mentioned that this is also a pending pandemic that can happen anywhere in the world. So we need access to it. Every country should be able to access to this treatment. I mean, just imagine what will happen. In COVID, we did not have treatments, and we saw the devastation happen. And here we will have treatments, and still the devastation will happen, except in a few countries because they are not letting others get these treatments. And it has been 3 years already, and we recently had Ebola uh,
Outbreak, yes.
outbreaks in so many countries. So it is really terrible what is happening, and that's what the report is saying, and saying that we need equity, we need different regulatory mechanism to ensure that everybody is thought to be a stakeholder, not only the government who funds it, and not only the pharmaceutical company which has the patent and monopoly over it. Everybody else should have a say. The patients, the doctors, the governments, where the countries where it happened. I think this will be a huge input for the pandemic treaty discussions also, because that is how it should happen when we talk about any treatments, any medicines. Yeah.
Right, Jyotsna, thanks a lot for joining us, and we'll be sure to catch up with you again as these meetings go on. I know there's a lot happening and limited time. Thanks a lot. Dortmund may break the stranglehold of Bayern Munich over the German championship on Saturday amid claims that everything is still possible by a key member of the Bayern team. Anything really could happen is what sports journalist Siddharthani told us over video conference a very short while ago. He's also been watching, like fans across the world, Man City, which faces Inter Milan in the Champions League final on 10 June. Is it two David and Goliath stories in the European football? That's one big question. Siddhant, thanks for joining us from what looks like a vacation spot. Siddhant, I guess you'll tell us whether the two stories we are discussing today are studies in contrast. Let's begin with Man City. What's the story over there?
Yeah, things are not always what they seem, Pragya. This trip of mine hasn't turned into a vacation yet, but I'll keep you updated on that front. The story there is that I think in some ways it was much like I think the World Cup was. It was preordained. It was always going to end this way, and I think over the course of the season, Arsenal did their best as far as the English league is concerned to make it interesting, to keep the column inches filled and the opinions flying about. But I think what we are seeing clearly is the emergence of a hegemon, not just in English football, but in European football in general. Yeah, we've seen it happen before, but for Man City, if they also go ahead and beat Inter Milan in the Champions League final, it'll be a treble, which means, I mean, it's not really a thing, but football fans have invented it, which means they would have won the English League, the Champions League, as well as the Cup in the same season. Now, only it's sort of one of those things that is hardly ever done. They would have won 3 titles. They have won 3 league titles in a row, which also has not been done very often. Only 2 managers have managed it before Pep Guardiola. So what Pep has is an ogre at his disposal with like way more money and way more resources. But together with that, he's had the ability over 6 years to put together a vision, a project at Man City that on the football field, I think those of us who've had the chance to watch them, there's been very little like it. The kind of football, for example, they played in the second leg of the Champions League semi-finals against Real Madrid. It was, you would not believe that they were playing against the most successful club in Europe ever. You know, at some times they were playing a game that existed on a different plane. So all of these factors, the money that is coming into the sport, and they have over 100 financial charges that they still have to answer for. So all of this might also just go away one day. It's not likely that that will happen, but it is possible that at the end of that investigation, which is currently underway, that all of these titles will suddenly be rescinded because they didn't play fair. But you have to marvel at the way big football and big capital has, kind of tried to make it all about the fact that Man City is super rich. So are a lot of other people in the neighborhood. But what they've done on the pitch, coupled with the complete sort of gap on the financial front, I think next season we'll only see Man City trying to do even more. Maybe win 4 titles in a row or 4 titles in the same season. Who knows? Yeah. So as things stand, I mean, yeah.
You're saying that this is not just about, we shouldn't focus just on the money part of it, that they have big funds coming in and also big wins. Is it?
I think we should do exactly that, but I think we should do that then in a more sort of universal manner and look at all the clubs. We talk often on
Sure.
this show about the money rankings when they come in and the kind of, after transfer seasons
Right.
where the clubs are spending billions of dollars or pounds or whatever currency you want on just trading players between themselves. And the whole sort of scenario is a bit like, you know, on steroids.
Sure.
Essentially. So the entire system needs to be evaluated. And when things come up like, justifications like trickle down things work because of the success of these big clubs, smaller clubs are allowed to exist. That's, I think, complete lies that the football watching public are being told by people who are supposedly in the know on the financial aspect of how football functions as a business. It's being done only to keep sort of the 0.1% of this, in any case, rarefied atmosphere, even more sort of safe in their bubble there, Pragya. Yeah, so it's also, Pragya, in some ways different from at least what to an extent is happening across other leagues in Europe, where some of this, hyper stratification is being challenged in a way.
You're talking about Dortmund, is it, and Germany?
Yeah, that's the next one to look forward to in that sense, or to talk about, because I think you've also covered on the show Napoli winning the Italian league title after a gap of 33 or so years. Yeah, quite a few years. So breaking the dominance that sort of Inter, AC, and Juventus have had over the league title there. Feyenoord have overtaken Ajax this time in the Dutch league, and they win these leagues sometimes, put together a team, and then a lot of these young players the team gets destroyed, eaten up by the bigger clubs. This time, Dortmund has done that significantly differently by investing in players who don't believe that Dortmund is like a shop window to go to a Real Madrid or a Manchester United or somebody like that. This is for them the final stage and where they want to win their trophies.
So
and I think
this is
that
sort
approach.
this is sort of a study in contrast, right?
Yeah, it is. On the one hand, I mean, because in England, at least next season, it's very difficult to imagine a force emerging that can contend with the kind of, all-round dominance that Man City has. So only they can sort of screw it up for themselves. But in other leagues around Europe, and of course, we're not talking about elsewhere in the world, but around these major leagues elsewhere in Europe, things are starting to change a little bit. 81 plus thousand people at Signal Iduna, which is the home ground of Dortmund, for their final game against Mainz. I mean, so these clubs are starting to understand that they have a very strong and passionate support base. They can manage the financial aspects of it. Okay, of course, they can't pay some of the ridiculous salaries that some of the other players or some of these clubs can afford. But despite that, can put together very competitive teams and even win trophies. So in that sense, like the hope that this entire structure is built on, that the little guy can challenge the big guy, it's fun to watch it happen once in a while.
No doubt. And thanks a lot for joining us. And that's all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. We'll return with our next episode on Monday with some of the most important stories from around the world. In the meantime, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and of course our stories on our website, peoplesdispatch.org.